timed ourselves at a fur farm. It's 2 people, in 15 minutes we were able to release 1,000 animals. Okay, those are the kind of results you cannot get doing anything else. The Fur Commission USA, which is a fur industry front group, I remember them saying at the time about our case when we got indicted. They had said that we had acted opportunistically, that was their quote. We had acted opportunistically when we chose to raid these fur farms. Now, they were trying to say that somehow we had seized upon some small little weak link in the animal abuse infrastructure and pounced on that as though this stuff was so difficult and only fur farms could be targeted. Well, couldn't be further from the truth. There was nothing opportunistic about it. When we decided to go after fur farms, we had so many options we didn't even know where to start. I mean, there was one place, and I won't even go specifics. I remember this place had a lot of animals. It was a horrific place. You could tell just from looking in their dumpster what they were doing to animals in that place. And I remember they had a whole wing of the building that was under construction, and you could see very clearly through the window not only animals, but also the fact that all their alarms were dismantled while they were doing this construction. And we had, and that was one of the places we had, it was totally possible for us to go into that place and get those animals out. Slaughterhouses, we had tons of ideas. Nothing that ever entered the conspiracy zone, but we certainly had plenty of ideas. So it was just simply a matter of what offered the best effort to yield ratio. That was it. That was the only equation. It wasn't that we didn't have any options. It was just simply how can we most efficiently save the most number of animals in the least amount of time with the least amount of risk. When I say effort to yield ratio, let me put this in solid numbers. I remember one time we timed ourselves at a fur farm. It's 2 people, in 15 minutes we were able to release 1,000 animals. Okay? Those are the kind of results you cannot get doing anything else. And the reason we did this, and the reason I really encourage seeing what's in your area, is that these industries thrive on one thing, and that's out of sight, out of mind. And when you remove that veil of secrecy, you go so far towards taking away their power. I have just barely stepped foot on NYU, so I can't say for a fact this is true at this campus. But I go to a lot of universities, and one thing I've taken note of over the years, and do this at NYU, walk around and just simply look at buildings that you think have a name that might indicate they experiment on animals. Whether it's the psychology building, psychology is always a safe bet, they almost always experiment on animals. Biology, anything with the word bio in it, health sciences, okay, these are going to be telltale signs that there's animals in these buildings. When you see a building like that on this university or any other large university, look up at the top of that building. And most of the time what you're going to see between the top row of windows and the actual roof of the building, you're going to see a windowless gap. That's where they hide the animals. Now think about what that means. There's actually secrecy built into the design of these buildings. They're not worried about animal rights. These buildings predate the animal rights movement. Okay, they're not worried about animal rights activists seeing what goes on in there. They're worried about anybody seeing what goes on in there. And it shows you clearly these people knew from day one that what they do is sick and it's wrong. So I think everybody needs to carry that burden of having seen too much. So please find out what's happening in your town. In my experience, you can simply walk into an egg farm about half the time. Slaughterhouses, not as secure as people think they are. Laboratories, a little bit different. During my time doing activism at the University of Washington, we had a table set up one day, and there was a guy that came up to the table, and he said that he worked in these laboratories, and that he supported animal research, but at the same time he saw some really bad things in there that he did not support. But he said that the university was so on edge about people seeing what went on in these places that even him, as an employee on a regular basis, would get stopped because they were so on edge. And he said there was only one person that ever got to walk through that building and was totally immune to suspicion. He said the FedEx delivery guy got to go wherever he wanted. And I always remember that. The FedEx guy gets to go wherever he wants. And there was a while ago I was in a thrift store actually, and I saw a FedEx delivery guy uniform. And I remember thinking about that. I think a lot of us know who the Weather Underground is. It's a fairly infamous group that carried out a series of political bombings in the, I think, 70s. They did a film about the Weather Underground. There was a quote from that film that I think captures so well what makes a good activist. They were fugitives, they got arrested, they served prison time, they'd gotten out. After they'd done all this, the interviewer asked them, why would you go so far? And I'll never forget what this person said. They said, there wasn't a single moment between the years of, 1960 whatever, 24 whatever, in 1974, there wasn't a single moment that they were not haunted by the images of what was happening to the people in Vietnam. And I think that captures, again, so well what makes a good activist. It's not just that you just load yourself up with a lot of data. It's something that happens on a very emotional level. Sometimes the only thing that can put those images out of your head is to simply go out between, when the sun sets and the sun rises, and just do what has to be done. When I go to a town, and I move around, probably a little bit more than the average person. When I get somewhere where I know I'm going to be for more than a month, I obligate myself, get on the internet, and find out what's happening in my town. And I will simply I'll go to the nearest university, and I force myself, as hard as it is, I'll force myself to stand outside these buildings and look up and know that in that building is this many animals, this species. I've been haunted by the things that I've seen. There was one time I'll never forget. It was actually on that 2-week road trip I spoke of, where we had an address for a fur farm. The information we had did not indicate the kind of species on this farm. So we showed up at this place, we parked on the street, walked down a very long dirt road, and we came up over the apex of this hill. Something was very off about this fur farm. The average mink cage is about that big. We were looking down on some cages that were, maybe the size of this podium here. And it was a full moon, and I remember looking down at the backlit image of some very, very large animals. To me, from a distance, I thought they might even be primates. I wasn't sure. And my friend and I sat there, and we looked down at this place, and we stared at it for a good 3, 4, 5, 7 or 8 minutes, just looking down at this place, trying to figure out what we were looking at. And then it hit me in a split second. We were looking down at more lynx, these wild cats, in one place than existed in all of the wild in the entire western United States. Lynx are a threatened species, but you can still raise those animals for coats. Talk about being haunted, that will definitely do it. How many people here are familiar with the term the Green Scare? This is an attempt to draw the analogy between the Red Scare of the 50s and the current repression of animal rights activists and environmental activists that has happened in the last few years. You've had a tremendous roundup. There's a lot of people serving a lot of time right now in prison for actions that were carried out on behalf of animals or the earth. And along with this roundup and these indictments and harassment and so forth, and I just found out today that my old roommate, the cops showed up and they were asking about me. I mean, this is stuff that happens all the time. Along with this, there's been a corresponding increase in the language that's used and sort of the hysteria that's created around animal rights activists. I realized right away when I got arrested that mine was not the average case. I realized there was one little word that was going to have a tremendous impact on not just the outcome of my case, but the conditions of my incarceration and numerous other things. That word is eco-terrorism, and I think we've all heard this word. It's a media buzzword, that even if it's something as small as breaking out the window at a McDonald's or rescuing an animal from an abusive situation. And I hope I don't need to tell too many people here that it's the the fur farmers of the world that are the true terrorists. It's the vivisectors that are the true terrorists. Activists are counter-terrorists, but nonetheless, it's worth talking about the weight of that one little word, eco-terrorism, and how that affects people. And the side effects of a politically charged case. Now, the first thing I noticed having a politically charged case is that they became absolutely obsessed with knowing who my friends were. And I realized that they weren't going after me, they weren't going after Peter Young, they were going after an entire movement. They were looking at me as their gateway to this movement. And the way this specifically manifested is within days of my arrest, they executed search warrants all around the Bay Area in California. I think they raided 2 or 3 homes, they searched a storage unit, they impounded a car, they subpoenaed phone records. And these were people that weren't necessarily believed to be linked to any specific crimes. These were people that just were believed to have some association with me during that time that I was considered a fugitive. When all the smoke cleared, they visited somewhere between 50 and 100 people around the country, knocking at the door, saying, "How do you know Peter Young?" and so forth. I remember my lawyer, who had no experience with a politically charged case, my first lawyer, when I got arrested, he pulled me out of the cell and brought me to the attorney booth in Santa Clara County Jail. And he's scratching his head and he's saying, I can't figure this out. These people are more interested in who your friends are than what you're actually accused of doing. And he said they're trying to create a master list of who your friends are. And I remember the time thinking, thank God I don't have a MySpace account. The next thing I thought is that this was going to have some very serious ramifications. People that had no reason to think they were ever going to be a target, all of a sudden were a target, simply because they were believed to have some association with me. Literally guilt by association. And when I got arrested, I had a backpack on me. And the FBI took this backpack and they scrutinized it down to every piece of lint in the whole backpack. What they came up with was a little scrap of paper at the bottom of my bag. And a friend of mine, unbeknownst to me, at the time, she had slipped this piece of paper in my backpack. It had a quote on it. It was a quote from the book Catcher in the Rye. She signed that quote, Holden Caulfield. This is the protagonist in the best-selling fiction book of all time. Now, the FBI became very interested in who this mystery Holden Caulfield was. And they began to run Holden Caulfield through their databases. They did a criminal history check on Holden Caulfield. And what they actually turns out, if you're interested in knowing, Holden Caulfield actually lives in Tempe, Arizona. So some very poor, unfortunately named old man got a knock at his door. When you get arrested, they're gonna probably let you sweat it out for a few months. But at some point, they're gonna come to you and they're gonna start to offer you plea bargains. And they're gonna offer you plea bargains that involve naming names. And some of those plea bargains might actually not even involve implicating anyone in any crimes. When I got arrested, they did let me sweat it out for about 3 months, and then they began to come to my lawyer. And when we hired the lawyer, we said, look, we're letting you know right now, cooperation is not an option. And he said, yes, I understand that, and I would not encourage you to ever do anything like that. He said he was obligated by some lawyerly code to pass on any information to me that the prosecutors gave to him. The first plea bargain they offered, I was looking again between 8 and 12 years. They came to me and they said, we're going to cut you loose in 3 years. All we want from you is when you get out in 3 years, to simply go back into the animal rights movement and feed us information. we want you to be our mole in the animal rights movement. Tell us who you know, tell us who they know, and so on and so on and so on. So we threw that one back in their face, and they came back again and they said, okay, now we're going to give you 2 years. All we want from you is simply to give us a complete list of every single person that you associated with during that time you were considered a fugitive. Now, it's very telling when you look at this plea bargain offer. They did not actually want me to implicate anyone in any crimes. All they wanted was names. I could have easily given them a complete list of names of every person whose couch I stayed at, or the people I hung out with, and there was really no reason to think anyone would have gotten in trouble. And I could have walked, and the FBI would have been happy, and I would have gotten out of prison. That's still a terrible thing to do. You should never give information to the police, no matter how seemingly benign. You just don't talk to police. And that's not legal advice, that's just what I would do if I was in that situation, what I did do. But, point being, at the end of the day, they came back again when I was looking, when I got my felonies dismissed. They came back a third time and they said, now we're going to give you 1 year if you give us a list of names. But, again, point being that it's very telling to look at the fact they did not want me to implicate anyone in any crimes. They wanted more names for that list of theirs. The next thing you notice having a politically charged case is they make an immediate attempt to exaggerate the scope of the conspiracy to encompass not just you and your friends, but the whole animal rights movement, or whatever movement. Specifically in my case, they tried to implicate national animal rights groups in funding us and training us. And to be even more specific, they said PETA actually did this, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. They said they actually funded us, and they dropped that theory pretty quick, but still they were trying to say it wasn't possible that somebody could get together with one other person and go carry out such an action. I mean, that's totally outside their paradigm. They think that it has to be some broader conspiracy. And it's really funny when you look at, just how really DIY this whole campaign of ours was. I mean, when we left town, we had literally $60. We had no idea how we were even make it past Idaho, let alone eat. And sometimes to eat, we would have to, we'd have to dumpster dive or whatever we had to do. And I remember there was, in Wisconsin, when we got there was some supermarket chain that would take their bananas when they got too old to eat. Instead of throwing them out, they would wrap red tape around them, and they'd sell them for 10 cents a pound instead of 90 cents a pound. So, because we were desperate and whatever, we would we learned very quickly to take the red tape off the old bananas and wrap them around the new bananas. So you get new bananas for 10 cents a pound. But the point being, that was something we had to do just to survive. And so, if PETA really was funding us, shame on them for only giving us 40 cents a day. Oh my gosh. And just lastly, you learn about the weight of one little word, and that's eco-terrorism, as I've been talking about. When I got arrested, having that one little word associated with me affected me in countless ways. When I got arrested, I got put in a cell block in Santa Clara County Jail, a jail with 1,000 people. They put me in a cell block with what was considered to be 14 of the worst people in the whole jail. There were only 3 other people in that cell block that were not in for murder. So I was considered to be that caliber of criminal. I couldn't leave my cell without being shackled at the hands and the feet. When they pulled me out of my cell, the entire floor had to lock down. I was seen to be this much of a threat. When they put me on Con Air, you've seen the movies, That actually exists. About 100 person capacity plane. Everyone's shackled at the hands and the feet. They fly federal prisoners and drop them off at prisons around the country. They put me on Con Air, and usually on every Con Air flight there will be 1 or 2 people that are deemed to be so high risk they have to have what's called a black box that goes over your handcuffs as an extra safety precaution. So, you know, of course I'm the guy that gets the black box. And I remember sitting there, and there was I was on the plane, and it's just like a retired commercial airliner, but there was a Hell's Angels bodyguard sitting on my right, and then there was a guy that was in for kidnapping on my other side. And I remember both of them sitting there looking at me like, what the fuck did this guy do? And I told them, I said, the only thing they say I did was release animals from some people's backyards. And they're like, yeah, right, dude, what did you really do? All the stories I'm telling you and all the stories I could tell you, multiply that times 5 or 10, and that's the experience of the average person in jail right now. I actually got off very easy. There's people right now that are literally held in maximum security prisons for what amounts to nothing more than essentially computer crime. I mean, it's bad. And I don't say this to scare anybody, but I do think it's worth noting that this stuff does happen. It happens to people a lot worse than it happened to me. This kind of hysteria continues after prison. When I got out of prison, you know, let me say this. If I told you that someone got out of prison on a rape conviction, and then I told you they were placed under surveillance by the FBI 24 hours a day for who knows how long, would you say, not, you know, that that's not justified, but would you say that seems a little bit off, that doesn't sound right to you, I don't really think they do that? Well, they do, probably don't do that to rapists. In fact, I'm sure they don't. That's what they did to me. They would put a car outside our house with a video camera, not very cleverly disguised, on the dash, aimed right at our front door, presumably just to see who came and went. We'd always joke, like, if we just walked out there with a big sheet and put it over the car, like, what would they charge us with? I don't know. When I got out of prison, some people were very nice, and they had a little party, kind of like a get-out-of-prison party for me in Hollywood. And I went, and it turns out, we later found out, actually not too long ago, they actually sent an agent to the undercover to the party, I guess, to see what kind of music eco-terrorists dance to, I don't know. And then again, today I just got a frantic call from an old roommate saying the cops have been harassing me all day, they're outside the house right now. So if you don't ever hear from me again, that's why. And it's worth, but it is important to have an audience to this stuff. I mean, it's important there are witnesses to this kind of stuff when it's happening. I think that whether prison to anyone in this room is a very direct threat or a very indirect threat, I think one of the best things that we can do for any movement is demystify prison. Talk about the myths as well as the realities in a very candid way. I don't think we should spare anybody the gory details, which oftentimes are real. But I think we should sort of work to demystify some of the myths as well. Prison has always been a part of every movement. Activists will always get locked up. Anytime a movement starts to be affected or starts to be a threat, people will get arrested. It's really interesting to look at the extent to which prison consumes activists. There's always this implicit belief that we're all just an inch away from going to prison. You have to take a really objective look and say, you could be next if we don't stop this, but we shouldn't overreact at the same time. And I call this kind of belief that we're all an inch away from prison, I call it the specter of consequence. And we do spend our activist careers looking over our shoulders for this boogeyman that practically never comes. There have been over 1,000 ALF actions since 1979. There have been less than 30 arrests for ALF actions. Of those 30, only a very small handful have resulted in any substantive prison time. And I think if you actually look at the people that have ended up in prison, and I'm speaking for myself more than anybody, you can analyze it and look and see very clearly what mistakes were made and isolate the fact that these were very easily avoided mistakes. So when you factor all this stuff in, you actually run the numbers. It all reduces prison to what I believe to be a statistically insignificant threat, even for people that do work outside the law. I don't know how many people have seen the film Behind the Mask. It's worth seeing. It's an ALF documentary, but somebody pointed out in the film that you have a better chance of dying in a car crash on your way to the grocery store than you do getting arrested for an action to save animals or the earth. Most of us would never consider crossing the legal line to save an animal, even though we're less likely to suffer severe consequences. It takes more skill to liberate a chicken from a factory farm than it does to sneak into a movie, okay? You know, when I was in high school, I used to sneak into movies. I know what that's like. There's actually people at the movies that are there to stop you. There's people all over the place. I've been to these factory farms. I go there, there's nobody there to stop you, and you can just walk right in. You expose yourself to a potentially greater legal consequence carrying a forged ID to get into a bar or a club if you're under 21 than you would, you know, being caught just trespassing in the basement of a laboratory at midnight. We are all animal liberators. We just don't know it. I guess it's worth talking about to what extent having a politically charged case affects your treatment by other inmates. When I got arrested, I had built up in my head what prison was like. I was in solitary for the first 6 weeks. They put me in Alameda County Jail, right outside Oakland. They took me off the bus and they put me in general population. And I remember it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and they shoved me in this holding cell that had like 50 guys in a room the size of your bathroom. The whole room went silent, and I certainly didn't look like anybody in that room. And somebody finally broke the silence at one point and said, "What did this motherfucker do? Cheat on the SATs?" I said, this is gonna be the next 2 years of my life, 5 years of my life, 10 years of my life. It's gonna be constant verbal harassment and who knows what else, probably worse. But that was county jail, and it's a different culture in county jail. When I actually got to prison, where people are actually doing long stretches of time, I found something very interesting about convict culture. When people started to learn why I was in prison, I found there was a very subtle amount of respect that was extended to me for being someone that was looked at for having stood up for his beliefs. And it really didn't matter if the beliefs that I had conflicted in every possible way with those of the other prisoners. All that matters is that I was looked at as being what they call a stand-up guy. I'm vegan, and I stayed vegan in prison. I've been vegan for 14 years, and it's very important to me. And it was very difficult in prison to do that at times. And so once a week in the dining hall, they'd give out apples. You go through the line with your tray, and they'd give you an apple. And I would hoard these apples. I'd pull them out of the trash. I'd talk to the prisoners, "Can I get your apples?" I'd save them in my cell just to get me through the week. On these apple days, I'd sneak out of the dining hall with like 8 apples in my jacket. I'd go to the library, and I'd go wherever. When I'd come back to my cell at night, I'd walk into my cell every day on those apple days, and I would find on my bed 8, 10, 15, 20 apples the other prisoners had rounded up and just placed on my bed. None of them, they never told me who they were. They never came around and said, "Hey, did you get those apples?" It was just a very subtle gesture of respect is like king in prison. One of the things I noticed living amongst people that we consider criminals, a lot of these people were in for things that were just as benign as it gets, and they were serving long prison sentences. But one thing that really struck me, and I was both impressed and disappointed at the same time, at the number of people that were in prison who had risked more for a little money than you and I ever will for animals. I was also struck by the ingenuity at work in some of these prisoners. There were computer hackers in prison that had carried out elaborate stunts to get access to documents, and these are people that would dress up in different disguises to get access into phone company headquarters and so forth to get their hands on documents. There were jewel thieves that would tell stories about learning how to pick locks or drop in through a skylight. I remember thinking, when was the last time an animal rights activist dropped in through a skylight to rescue a dog from HLS or something? Well, actually that did happen. But it's actually anywhere else. If I could sum it up in 1 or 2 sentences, this is what I'd say: that we as activists, we have unlimited weapons at our disposal. Okay, we have a toolbox that is bottomless. There is no end to the tactics that we can employ to achieve our goals. The FBI, prosecutors, they have only one weapon. They've got only one tool they can use against us, and that's prison. Okay, that's all they've got. So when we demystify prison and we talk about it, we have one less thing that stands between us and that world that we're fighting for. If you are someone who's fighting for a better world, I would just encourage everyone to ask yourselves how you can fight smarter and not harder. How you can fight to achieve your goals in the most efficient way possible. There's an animal rights conference that happens every year, and I think it's a great thing. It happens in DC and LA every year, and somewhere between 700 and 1,000 people will take time off work to go to this conference every summer. They'll buy plane tickets, they'll invest money in hotel rooms, and they make a big production out of going to this conference, and that can be a good thing. But here's a fact you can't argue. If every single one of those people, instead of diverting all those resources toward going to such and such conference, if they simply paired off and went to a fur farm tonight, and the very next night they went to a slaughterhouse, and the very next night they went to a laboratory, there would not be an animal rights conference next year because there would be no animal abuse industries. If everyone that went to that conference paired off and went to a fur farm tonight, there would possibly be no fur industry overnight. That is fighting smarter and not harder. I've never heard of a struggle that's won by just putting a flower in a gun barrel. I know a lot of battles that have been won with crowbars and a good pair of gloves. When we released those mink from those fur farms, there was no amount of letters in the world that would have saved those mink. They were all slated to be killed from within 2 to 4 weeks. When activists went into a laboratory in Iowa and rescued over 400 animals, there was no legal protesting that would have saved those animals at that time. And when activists went into a toxicology lab at Louisiana State University and just went in that laboratory and destroyed every piece of equipment used to torture animals, there was no legal channels they could have gone through to accomplish that. So that is fighting smarter, not harder. And there are some battles that are going to be won with a very reasoned argument, and there's a lot more that are going to be won with claws and fangs. And I think it is our obligation as activists for those animals that cannot speak for themselves and cannot fight for themselves, not defend themselves, to be their claws and their fangs. If you're really dedicated to what you're fighting for, you need to ask yourself, if this is not just something cool that you do with your friends, if this is something you truly believe in, and you believe in a better world, ask yourself what you're going to do if you wake up tomorrow and all your friends are gone. Now, we do need, if we're going to achieve the societal change that we need, we are going to have to win mass numbers of people over to this consciousness. Concurrently with that, we need to emphasize the power that one person has. It only takes one person to go into an egg farm with a video camera, videotape the conditions in that egg farm, release it to the media with a press release, and expose millions of people to the conditions of factory farm animals. It only takes one person to get a job in a lab, document the conditions in that lab, again, have a press conference and expose the world to what's happening. It only takes one person to go down to an overpass at rush hour, hang a banner with whatever message you want, and expose the world to that message. If you ask yourself if we're going to win in our lifetime, and you come to the conclusion maybe we won't, do not be discouraged. I think what's more important than that is that we keep our eye on the ball of total victory, that we also emphasize that there can be a lot of victories along the way. You educate people about a vegan diet and they adopt a vegan diet. Every animal you save as a result of that person being vegan, every one of those lives is a victory. Remember those pictures I showed you at the beginning. Don't just get upset, get angry, and then go out there and get active. That's all I got. So thank you.
The question is, what are your thoughts about the whole capitalist system that sees a profit as the bottom line and exploitation of all working people and super exploitation of women, people of color, immigrants, and animals as their main method? What are your thoughts about making alliances with others struggling against the brutal property relations of this system, so that at a certain point we can overthrow it and bring about a world of equality, justice, communal sharing, and veganism?
Well, sure. I mean, capitalism, when you try to take things further and further back, that is going to get to pretty close to the fundamental issue as to why animals are so systematically abused in this culture. As far as building alliances, there's certainly nothing wrong with building alliances in and of itself. A lesson I've had to learn is that it's really important that as activists you don't work on fixing your weaknesses, but you leverage your strengths. Just be very careful and don't reach out to other people for the sake of reaching out to other people. Reach out to other people because it's going to make this world a better place. I guess that's it.